time for our Fireside chat. I'm very excited about this. My name is Matt Stratton. I'm helping out moderating this great chat where we're going to be talking about building reliable and resilient teams using DevOps practices. You all don't want to hear too much about me, but you're going to hear for a second. I'm a staff developer advocate at Pulumi. I'm one of the global chairs of DevOps Days, and I live here in Chicago. And that's enough about me. My guest for this Fireside chat is the Director of Production Operations at Centro, also here in Chicago. He's got a great new book out, which he'll tell you all about. But enough about me. Let's welcome my guest, Jeff Smith.
Matty, what's up, man?
We figured it out.
Yeah. I was super nervous leading up to it. It was almost like tripping on stage when you're walking out live. It's just like, okay, don't fall.
So I think we are going to be taking some questions. Obviously, I shouldn't say obviously. Nothing's obvious. We're all learning. We'll be taking your questions. So give us those questions. But before we kind of kick into that, I have one question for you, Jeff, which is, how do you see the DevOps analog of the 1984 Chicago Cubs lineup connecting to DevOps?
Oh, whoa, that was a curveball, man. 84. Well, I'll be honest. I have been in Chicago for the last 15 years, so I don't have all of that 84 Cubs energy. Yeah, I know. Believe it or not, back then I was a Mets fan, and life was dark, but I've seen the light. So, whew.
Well, maybe we'll take this one up on Twitter because, everyone's like, I thought this was a chaos engineering conference. Who the heck is Bobby Dernier, right? So we're kind of done with that.
Cubs and chaos are synonymous.
Before we kind of jump in, I just wanted to kind of, give a little bit. I in your intro, I said, you've got a book out on DevOps patterns and anti-patterns, and really kind of building those teams. So, as we're waiting for these questions to roll in, like, what do you think is one of the strongest, I guess, I don't like to focus on the negative, but what is like one of the strongest anti-patterns that you see with people trying to kind of build these teams and operate?
Yeah, I think one of the biggest anti-patterns that I see is this sort of disconnection of goals in terms of, what teams are incentivized to do X and what teams are incentivized to do Y. And typically when we set these goals up, there's a little bit of inherent conflict there, right? So, I think when we can focus these teams and align their goals so that we're all marching in the same direction, you get so much more impactful outcomes when we say, okay, development is just as responsible for reliability and uptime as operations is. Suddenly, the lens and the focus begins to change. I've been desiring to push that even further and put it on product as well, right? Because product is really at the driving wheel when it comes to prioritization. So when it comes to the work that needs to get done to ensure reliability, to ensure resiliency, why not also have the people that are responsible for putting the tickets in the queue have some skin in the game as well? It's kind of like burial insurance, right? Like, everyone knows they should have burial insurance, but at the end of the day, you're kind of like, it's not really my problem. Same thing with reliability, right? Like if we don't put it in the hands of the people that are actually making those types of decisions, it'll always be, sort of second best.
I think one of the things that really sticks to me about that is that things like security and reliability, they are features. They're not features that your customers are going to necessarily explicitly ask you for or in those words, but they're absolutely features that your customers expect and need out of your product. Right. Besides, the buttons that do the things, like the buttons have to be there and they have to do the thing.
Absolutely. And I think when you think of it as a feature, right, we understand that it's not an inherent trait in the system. And I think when you go further up the food chain in an organization, there are so many assumptions about things that are being done as just sort of a natural byproduct. Well, yeah, okay, we built the tool, but of course it's secure, because why would we not build it that way?
Why would we build an insecure tool? That's just...
Yeah, exactly.
That makes no sense.
Right. And when we think about it as a feature, as something that needs to be prioritized, something that needs to have work represented, on the board so that we know that we're doing this work, I think the message becomes clearer to those that are maybe further disconnected from the work, but are making major organizational decisions around, again, prioritization of work and what are the things that we're going to focus time and energy on. Because for them, it's just like, well, yeah, naturally, this thing is super secure because, right, that's how all software comes out.
Right, because that's just good practices. So Aaron in the chat has a question, says, what are your top 3 tips for ensuring that DevOps and design ops collaborate effectively?
Ooh, DevOps so I mean, I think with any of these DevOps, design ops, DevSecOps, first, it's always going to be communication, right? You have to communicate both. For starters, you have to communicate what the purpose of each team is, because that is often an assumption that I find is erroneous, right? So a lot of teams, when you talk to them, they may not fully understand what it is that operations does or what it is that design does. So let's not take that for granted. So first, introducing the groups so that we understand where they sit in the delivery pipeline and the value that they're adding and what their goals are. 2 is communication, right? Like I said, aligning goals, making sure that their success is your success, and that we're all measured at some level on the total product, right? The entire lifeline. And then, just making sure that we have some empathy and understanding of what are the barriers that this group has that you might be able to alleviate in that sense, right? So understanding that team's agenda and saying like, okay, what can I do to make you more effective? And for ops people, if you're listening, this is a great way to be proactive about your contributions, right? One of the downsides I feel like to ops is you're always in charge of preventing the disaster, but no one really gives you credit for the system not blowing up, right? Because it's not supposed to blow up. But this is a great opportunity to get ahead of it and interact with these different teams, whether it be design, finance, anything, and offer your expertise and to help solve problems for different areas of the business.
Well, a lot of ways I always think about that. Ops is very similar to being like corporate legal, right? Nobody knows all the times that your legal department keeps your company from being sued. You just know about the times that they miss, right? And the same thing is generally true with ops. Like, this keeping things running smoothly is a non-event, right? And so making that work visible is really, really important. And I think Jeff's right, like connecting that into that being more than just sort of a service that's provided, but being part of that life cycle makes that work visible. So this thing. So we talk a lot about, collaboration being kind of the key. And one of the things that I think is interesting is of all the kind of tenets and thoughts around DevOps, like, we kind of talk about in columns, and then, Emily talked about SOAR, and I want to kind of talk about that with you in a minute. But culture is always one of the ones that's hardest to measure, right? You can't put a Nagios agent on your people. And so how, question in the chat is, are there any organizational behaviors or tenets to be adopted for transformation to be successful? And I kind of want to put a little bit of a spin on that. And like, how do you measure that you're moving the needle on improving these cultural tenets?
So I personally feel like, measuring that is always just going to be a indicator of sentiment across your organization, right? But there are things that you can do ahead of time to recognize if that meter is going to move. And what I mean by that is like, and I talk about this a little bit in the book. When we talk about culture, we always define it as some sort of like mission statement, right? Something that we hang on the wall that we talk about and we point to and we say that's awesome, right? But culture is more than that. Culture is rituals, right? It's values, it's artifacts. There are other symbols, or there's other pieces to culture that exist that sort of reinforce the idea that this happens. So you have to think about it like a system. So if we say we value testing, right? Let's very, very straightforward one, right?
Sure.
What are you doing organizationally that expresses that value, right? Do you require testing as part of your pull request? Is it automatically checked and validated that yes, this has test cases and there's X% coverage or whatever metric you want to use? What are the rituals and behaviors that we're doing that express these cultural desires. So just sitting up and saying like, yeah, we value testing, that's not good enough. So, the example is like, if you go to a company like Google, right, and you submit code with 0 test cases, the organization itself is probably going to reinforce that culture. Like, no, bro, we don't do that here, right? You need some of that Google energy, write some test cases. So I think the first thing you can do is ask, all right, if these are your cultural values, what is as an organization are you doing to reinforce these values so that they produce some sort of artifact, ritual, or process?
But also, I think it's really key to always think about like, what are you doing that unintentionally is reinforcing the different behavior? People ask me a lot. They say, Maddie, like, what's the best book to read about DevOps? And I say, the book to go read is Freakonomics. Go learn about incentives. Then we can talk about DevOps. And, Jez Humble is a great apocryphal story about a place he was, helping out. And they had a thing that said, we add a test to every sprint, which ended up with a lot of tests that were assert equals true. Right. So it's like people will work to the measurement that you give them. And it's not because people are bad or anything like that. It's just a lot of times it's not even really like, that was kind of an over the top example, but it usually, and that's not usually what you're going to see with these unintentional consequences. It's not going to be something as egregious or blatant as that. It's just going to be these more subtle behaviors. So kind of understanding what incentives are you encouraged, or sorry, what behavior do those incentives maybe encourage that you aren't thinking about as well, and then continually adjust. Because you might say like, hey, okay, it's a good idea. Let's do this. Let's put this kind of place in, policy or approach in place. And then, but that's why we're always measuring, right? Because you might say like, oh, well, we thought this was going to change things this way, but turns out not. So let's go back and let's revisit and understand this decision we made. We might have to kind of do a little bit of a retrospective maybe.
And it's funny because people always assume, to that point, people always assume that, so culture exists, whether it's good or bad, right? And people assume that when we're talking about reinforcing culture and whatnot, we're only talking about good stuff. But like you said, you can accidentally be reinforcing bad culture. I don't remember who said it, but I absolutely love the line, culture is what you reward and punish, right? And, that sort of echoes true. If you've got particular behaviors that you're consistently rewarding, then that's the culture that you're going to breed, right? Because as human beings, right, as awful as it is, that's sort of how we gravitate. So you're right. You have to sort of keep a pulse, and the only true indicator of culture is how people are feeling in the organization. So are you surveying your people? How frequently are you surveying them? And listening to what some of the gaps are that exist in your organization.
I mean, we could talk for hours about behavior and incentives. I think that the thing I want to kind of leave people with on this, and we can take it up again more in Slack, but move on, is that reward and punish are not, again, always intentional, right? Like and this is where when you think about the ideas around psychological safety, right? Like what are you reinforcing in the ways you communicate, in how you talk about things, in the way that happens, versus it's not always going to be as explicit as like, if you do this, you'll get fired. Right. But it's, if you do this, people will make fun of you. If you do this, you will be shut down, or if you don't do this. Right. Yeah. So it's basically what we're trying to say. I like to say, the tech is easy, y'all. People are hard. So give yourself some grace. The people are tough. This is tough work. So another question in the chat says, when we talk about the different skills, dev and ops that participate in DevOps and all the various skills in these cross-functional teams, do they share the same responsibilities, or is there a difference? Or is the answer, it depends? Which means I think we can't answer that with it depends, unfortunately. So
I think it depends, right? Like, I hate to say it. Do they all share the same responsibility? That really, I guess we all share the same responsibility in terms of the product that we're delivering, right? So we all share the same responsibility in that we need to deliver a solid, reliable product, right, that our users, customer base can use and enjoy, and we can get feedback on. So from that perspective, we all share that responsibility. But in any organization, I think it's unrealistic to think that, the age old adage, quality is everybody's job, right? And it is, but at the same time, right, like there's got to be a bit more of a focus on it, right? We have to say quality is everyone's job, right? But developers, you need to write unit tests. QA, you need to write integrations and end-to-end testing. So I say from that perspective, it depends, but I think we all have this sort of overarching goal to the quality of our product and how it's delivered. And as, depending on where you are in that delivery pipeline, you may say like, well, I don't have the ability to influence X or Y, but I believe you do, right? I think it's incumbent on us to understand how our applications work, because if it's not in a space that you deal with, it's very easy to just sort of punt it. I think where I really got this lesson for me was at Grubhub, where when I was working, I actually had a vested interest in the product. Before then, I was supporting law software and healthcare, right? So I didn't really care about the product. But when it came to get my food to deliver, you best believe I knew that entire pipeline. So I would come in on a Tuesday like, listen, whatever we're doing Monday night,
was
right?
late.
Right. So let me go ahead and give some feedback on that. So getting involved in understanding your organization, the product that you deliver, that's incumbent on everyone, and being able to kick the tires and offer feedback and see where things are weak. From that perspective, it's everyone's responsibility to sort of help contribute to the product where they can.
I like to say a lot of times in my talks, I'll start and say, do you know how your company makes money? If not, go find out. I'll wait. Right. And this was illustrated to me too with a friend of mine who was working in ops at a large retailer, and it was during, what normally would be a freeze time, and they needed to make some changes. And, they were like, hey, no, but the site, and, or manager was like, hey, you think your job is to keep the site up, but actually your job is to help us sell stuff. Right. And now but I really I kind of want to go back to what you said. Like, I really like this idea of, we all have a common mission, which is to help the company sell shoes. I mean, provided that's what your company does. If you're a law firm, then maybe don't sell so many shoes. But the way we express how we help fulfill that goal will be different depending upon where you fit in that cross-functional team. So we have a common outcome, business outcome, and business outcomes are key. And also, I spent the last year helping folks in the public sector. So, I mean, yes, I know it's not always make money, but you know what I mean. I will say something very interesting with my time with public sector is folks in the public sector understand their agency's mission way better than most people in the private sector know how their company actually operates. Like you ask someone in the public sector, what is the mission of the Texas Workforce Commission? They know it. You ask somebody at a certain, like, how do you make it? They'll be like, oh, they can spout off like the mission. Well, our job is to help people entertain themselves better with blah, blah, blah. Like, no, how does Netflix actually make money? Oh, right. Well, I don't actually know,
to that point, really quick, a comment that I made that was really impactful to me. So when I joined Centro, it's an digital advertising software, and I'm not really stoked about ad tech, right? Like, it's hard for me to get up. I'm just going to be honest. It's like, ad tech. But the way it was sold to me was like, there is a terrible workflow in the advertising industry that needs addressing. And Centro puts every single employee through training that shows you this is the way the world does it today. This is how our tool solves that problem. And it gives you such a clarity that you probably wouldn't have bought into if you didn't go through that training, because you're like, it's advertising, I don't really need to get involved there. But, like being an efficiency sort of nut, it's like, oh, I get it, right? Now I know where I live in the value chain and how I can push that out to other parts of the organization.
So we have another question in the chat says, where and how does the alignment of incentives start? Is this around like creating SLOs and monitoring them? Is it around observability? Like, where do you start this alignment of incentives?
Right. So, sort of.
Come on, Jeff, solve all our DevOps transformation problems in the next, 6 minutes.
Yeah. Reflecting back on Emily's talk, I think of Swift, right? So I think of like, what are the things that we can do quickly to sort of align on high level goals? So maybe there's something as easy as, availability that we're sharing or performance numbers, right? Like you need to normalize it first because most organizations aren't accustomed to having these goals so strictly blended. So, to take two teams that haven't had goals aligned and then just sort of slam them together could create a bit of a friction. But if you can create something that's high level that everyone sort of agrees on and then iterate on that based on your specific use case, that helps a lot. Also identifying what some of the problem areas are for the teams and figuring out how those teams can work together to sort of solve those in terms of delivery. So for example, my team is busy automating a bunch of work for developers to be able to do, self-service stuff, right? And when I do that, it's going to increase developer productivity, right? Why does that have to be my job alone though, right? These guys are developers. These folks are developers. That's what they do. So how can they help me, right, deliver automation for them? And it could be as simple as like, hey, I've written the function, you're going to have to plug in credentials, but the work is done. I've written test cases. That sort of collaboration to say like, okay, now together we have reduced this turnaround time for, the script ticket that needs to get run in production every week. It's gone from a weekly turnaround to hours. And that is help that both prod ops and developers worked on together to deliver. So find those wins, and then you just start slowly moving down the stack and identifying those problem areas. And new problem areas are always going to sync up. So I don't want to say that, the alignment has to be like, instantly revenue impactful, but still the things that you care about, figure out how do we tie these teams together so that they can work together effectively.
I like that thought too. When you're talking about what you're working on right now, is I really like this idea about treating the service, our internal services, as products, right? Because if but I don't want to say normal, but a common thing in what you're describing would be like, okay, well, I'm going to put this thing together and then I'm going to give it to the developer team, and that's what it is, right? You wouldn't do that with your consumer facing product. Well, I mean, you might, but it probably wouldn't be very successful. And I think treating it can get kind of weird sometimes for people to be like, well, you want to treat my colleagues as customers. I'm like, well, I mean, I don't mean put a lot of artificial stuff about it. None of this is about like chargeback and stuff like that, but just like, how would you treat this as a product, right? You would iterate on it. You would learn. You would talk to your customers. You would understand what they actually need. And yeah, sometimes they don't know what they need, and you're not just going to build. Again, I just want to point this out that it's not like, okay, just do whatever the development team tells you they want, because, sometimes they don't know, right? Yeah. Or don't have the, again, it's a partnership. It's collaboration, like Jeff was saying.
So let me share a story with you really quickly. So I've been approaching that the exact same way, where I said, I want to make the infrastructure platform a product. So I went and I started interviewing QA engineers, software engineers, to get a sense of what they want. And when we originally built this automation platform, we thought that developers wanted access to all the levers and buttons and whatnot. And when we talked to them, we realized what they want is confidence, right? They don't really care how that's delivered, but they want the confidence to know that what they've developed on their workstation is going to work when it gets into production. The particulars of it, they're like, I don't really care about it. I want to tell you, this is my branch. I want that branch deployed to some mythical environment that's going to mimic production, that if I do my testing across that, I'm going to feel confident. So meanwhile, we're working on all these features about being able to grant access dynamically and to be able to scale your workload and all that. And they're like, no, I don't really care. I just want this code to go to an environment that looks like production. All that other stuff is for like the 10% of our power developers that are really into that, right? But, we ended up developing a system to address the minority of our user community.
I think when, sorry, one thing, another, I speak professionally for a living. Question that I'm interested in your thoughts on this one too. So question came up and is like, okay, we think about, and we might have to kind of deconstruct this question a little bit, but think about cooperation and competition within teams and between teams. Like, how do you find a balance? And so that I'm trying to sort of deconstruct that competition part about where is there competition between teams. And I'm not thinking about like, there's places I've worked with where there's an overarching company that actually is a bunch of verticals that all compete with each other. I don't think that's what the thought is here, but I guess teams get competitive, maybe when they're cross-incented.
Yeah, I'll be honest. I have not been in an environment where any sort of constructed like competition across teams has proven effective in the long term. Because eventually, what happens is it sort of entrenches this us versus them mentality. And it really is, when you think about it, to me, the core of like, what was at the heart of the DevOps movement, prior, right? Like, it was dev versus ops. There was that sort of competition that created friction. So when I worked at Accenture, I worked in the performance testing group, and there was another performance testing group, and company and teams could choose which group they wanted to go to. So there was this sense of competition between us. But like, when I was able to get some software running on, this Dell system running a version of Solaris, surprisingly, I didn't want to share that with the other team, right? Because that was something that we could offer that they couldn't. And we were incentivized because, basically if your team doesn't get enough in chargebacks, that team gets, destroyed, dismantled. And maybe you find another home in the organization, maybe you don't. So, that's not to say it's not possible. It's just to say that my experiences with it have been limited. I feel like cooperation is the much better avenue, and incentivizing that cooperation.
There can be really interesting things. And I just going to kind of touch on this, and we're starting to run out of time, but with that collaboration, when you're talking about kind of having teams that compete, and in some organizations, it's sort of like, well, how would that ever happen? Again, back to like public sector, I saw this a lot because so much in the public, especially in the state and local agencies that I worked with, a lot of this work was done by system integrators. So you might have at this particular agency, this one integrator is kind of running your platform, and this other one is doing software development. They're actually not very well incented to work together to help make the other one more successful, because they actually might be competing with each other on a different bid, right? It's like, why do I want to make Jeff's consulting company system integrator do better? Because we're actually competitors. And so there's not an easy answer for that, but it is. So if you are in a scenario like that, just know that it's really challenging. And then I just want to hit one more question, and then I think we need to kind of wrap up because everybody's ready for a well-earned break. So I saw Tammy asked in the Slack and said that, asking developer productivity and efficiency interview questions like you talked about is really tough. And it's really hard to kind of craft those questions because either I'm editorializing, right? Because either sometimes they can be leading, or sometimes they're not really going to get you what you're looking for, so to speak. So what are your tips, especially with this work you've been doing? Like, how do you ask those good questions?
Yeah. So what we did was, we leaned on people with that expertise. So there's a UI UX research group, at Centro that deals with it from the product perspective. And we brought them in and said like, hey, we're not asking you to understand, right, the details of the question, but we want you to understand, we want you to get your feedback on the structure of the question to make sure it is in a way that is not necessarily leading, make sure that we're providing like an open-endedness to it so that we're not steering in a particular direction. So a lot of our questions, and I'm happy to share them with folks, because I actually collaborated with folks on Twitter about this to sort of come together with this list of questions, and got a lot of great feedback from some folks. But questions like, why do you build an integration environment? What triggers you to build an integration environment? What is the most complicated thing for you in the delivery pipeline? So you're asking questions that may not necessarily land in your group. And we had a lot of answers where it was like, whoo, wow, we asked a bunch of questions and none of our stuff came up. And that's great. But it was also good to have that sort of feedback to be able to say like, hey, data science group or big data, these are things that folks are struggling with. We need to take a look at this. But it was really about, just asking and crafting these sort of open-ended questions about the nature of work that they were doing, the nature of the problems that they were encountering, and then sort of teasing those details out as they were provided, as opposed to prompting for them. So one of the questions was, how did you solve these problems in a previous environment, in a previous job? Right? Do you like do you like the Centro approach better or the previous approach better, and why? So getting that sort of open-ended conversation going was extremely helpful.
Awesome. Well, we are at time, so if you didn't get your question answered, Jeff will be in the Slack for at least a little bit, and we can find him on Twitter. at Dark and Nerdy, and we'd love to continue this conversation. Jeff, this has been great. The time flew by. I always love it when a conference gives me an excuse to just talk to my friend for half an hour. So thank you, Failover Conf, for facilitating this, and we'll see you all on the internets.